Above me is a model of the famous B-17, a Boeing B-17, also known as a Flying Fortress. The 1930s, there was a lot of discussions about aviation and air warfare and what it took to defeat the enemy. In World War I, of course, shortly after the war started in August, the sides dug in and built trenches. Later on, it was thought a smarter way to do warfare would be to bomb the industrial centers of the enemy. And the British idea was to bomb at night because it was safer. They had less opposition from the enemy airplanes. The United States Air Force decided precision bombing was the way to go. And the B-17 was designed in 1935, first went into service about 1938. They built 12,000 of them, 12,700 of them, between 1936 and 1945. The thought at the time was that the bombers would always get through. In fact, at that time, the bombers were actually faster than the fighters. So the fighters couldn't keep up. So they thought, well, we don't need the fighter protection. We'll just fly enough airplanes with accurate enough bombings during the day that we'll be able to paralyze the industry of the Germans. And in fact, they flew huge formations. Early in the war, this aircraft in back of me, the nose turret was designed later in the war, probably 1942 or 43, to provide an extra couple of machine guns at the front, because most of the opposition of the Luftwaffe was coming from the front. They decided that was the best way to attack the bombers, because if you shoot from the front, you're probably going to kill the pilots. The aircraft in back of me is a later model B-17 because it has a nose turret under the chin turret, I guess you might call it. It's under the nose of the airplane. 250 caliber machine guns there. Otherwise, they had at least 10 machine guns aimed from the back, from the rear, underneath, on top, and in front. The Germans were quite afraid of these airplanes, by the way, because they realized that this thing had guns all over the place. And they tried different ways of attacking them, first from the back and then from the side, and finally from the front was the most successful way, because that way they could kill the pilots. And killing the pilots basically doomed the aircrew. Very few people were trained to fly the airplane except for the pilots. The final E and F models were the ones with the nose turrets. They quit producing them in 1945, and along the way they built 12,700 of them. In other words, they built more B-24s than the B-17s. They said the top speed in flight was 260 miles an hour. I think in actual fact they were flying on their attack missions above 20,000 feet, but probably closer to 200 miles an hour, maybe even 180 miles an hour. These airplanes were extraordinarily rugged, tremendous amount of damage that would be done to these airplanes, and they could still make it back and fly on one engine sometimes. Tremendous amount of them were lost. 4,735 of the B-17s were lost over Europe. Fortunately, the last missions were called chow hound missions, where they were dropping food into Denmark, into Holland. There was a few still flying in the United States to do it in air shows. The armament, basically they carried, the airplane weighed around to 25,000 pounds dry and could carry up to 8,000 or 10,000 pounds of, when they were finally loaded up with fuel and everything else, 58,000 pounds was the total weight for takeoff. Takeoff speed was about 100 miles an hour, landing speed was about 75. They typically flew 25,000 feet. The significance of that is the people in the front of the airplane had some sort of heating. They all wore oxygen, and at altitude, with the doors open on the side for the machine gunners, the temperatures could be 30, 40, 50 degrees below zero. There were probably more people lost from freezing than from wounds. A significant thing about the bombers and the mission they were flying was that in the early part of the war, tremendous amount of injuries and casualties. If you were on the ground and wounded, you had a 3 out of 4 chance of surviving because the medical were right there. If you were in the air and you were wounded by gunnery or shrapnel, your chances are 3 out of 4 of dying in the air. It was far more dangerous. It's significant to know that with the thousands of bomber raids that they had, every time an airplane was shot down, either B-24 or B-17, 10 aircrew were either killed or ended up prisoner of war. At the end of the war, in a town called Moosburg, there was 80,000 American aircrew members being held captive.